The massive alien warship moved through space like a metal mountain. Its dark hull stretched for miles, covered in weapon ports and sensor arrays that glowed with menacing red light. This was the Void Talon, flagship of the Krillian Empire's Third Fleet, and it had never known defeat. On the command bridge, General Vexstar stood watching the viewscreen with satisfaction. His reptilian form towered over his crew, standing nearly 9 feet tall with obsidian black scales that gleamed under the bridge lights. His yellow eyes focused on the small human vessel drifting helplessly in space ahead of them. The human ship was pathetic. Barely 300 feet long, it looked like a toy compared to the Void Talon. Smoke leaked from several hull breaches, and its engines flickered weakly. The vessel spun slowly, clearly damaged and unable to escape. "Report," Vexstar commanded, his voice a deep rumble that made the bridge crew straighten. Commander Zekthal, his second-in-command, consulted his tactical display. "The alien vessel appears to be a scout ship, General. Our weapons disabled there. Engines and communication array. Life signs show only 7 beings aboard, and most appear to be injured or unconscious." Vexstar's mandibles clicked together in what passed for Krillian laughter. 7 beings. The mighty human race that had been sending exploration ships into this sector was defended by 7 individuals in a damaged scout ship. This would be even easier than conquering the Zelani homeworld. "Any response to our demands for surrender?" Vexstar asked. "None, General. Their communication systems appear completely disabled." "Excellent. Prepare a boarding party. I want to see these humans for myself before we begin the conquest of their colonies." The general made his way to the docking bay, followed by 12 of his finest warriors. Each Krillian soldier stood over 8 feet tall, their thick scales serving as natural armor. They carried plasma rifles that could burn through solid steel, and their claws could tear through most known metals. In 300 years of expansion, no species had ever successfully resisted a Krillian. Boarding party. The boarding ship attached to the human vessel with a soft thud. Vexstar's soldiers cut through the airlock with plasma torches, filling the corridor with bright sparks and molten metal. The general stepped through first, his weapon ready, expecting to find cowering aliens begging for mercy. Instead, he found something unexpected. The human ship's corridors were narrow and cramped compared to Krillian vessels, but they were also eerily quiet. Emergency lighting cast red shadows on the walls, and the air smelled of smoke and something else he couldn't identify. "Spread out," Vexstar ordered. "Find the survivors and bring them to me." His soldiers moved through the ship efficiently. Within minutes, they had secured the vessel and gathered the unconscious humans in the cargo bay. 6 of them appeared to be civilians, wearing simple clothing and bearing no weapons. They were small and fragile-looking, with pale skin and soft features that reminded Vexstar of the herbivorous species his empire had enslaved, but it was the 7th human that caught his attention. This one was awake, sitting calmly on a supply crate despite being surrounded by armed Krillian warriors. He wore a torn military uniform with insignia that Vexstar didn't recognize. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, and his left arm hung at an odd angle, clearly broken. Despite his injuries, he watched the Krillians with steady eyes that showed no fear. The human was small, even by his species' standards, barely 5 feet 8 inches tall, with a lean build that looked almost fragile next to the massive Krillian soldiers. His brown hair was disheveled, and his face bore the pale complexion of someone who had lost blood. Everything about him screamed weakness. Vexstar approached slowly, studying this first representative of humanity. After a moment, he couldn't help himself. A deep, rumbling laugh escaped his throat, echoing through the cargo bay. "This?" he said, gesturing at the injured human with one clawed hand. "This is what humanity sends to defend itself?" The human looked up at him without flinching. "Lieutenant Jake Morrison, Earth Marines," he said simply, his voice steady despite his obvious pain. "Marines," Vexstar repeated, tasting the unfamiliar word. "And what exactly does a Marine do, Lieutenant Morrison?" "We fight," Jake replied. This brought another laugh from the general. "Fight?" This tiny, injured creature could barely sit upright, let alone fight a Krillian warrior. Vexstar had seen combat drones more impressive than this human. "I have conquered 47 worlds," Vexstar said, leaning down to bring his massive head closer to Jake's eye level. "I have destroyed fleets 10 times larger than anything your species possesses. I have watched entire civilizations kneel before the might of the Krillian Empire. And you think you can fight us?" Jake studied the general's face for a moment, taking in the predatory yellow eyes and rows of sharp teeth. "Maybe," he said finally. "Depends on whether you're as tough as you look." The sheer audacity of the response caught Vexstar off guard. Here was a being that couldn't possibly weigh more than 200 pounds. Injured and alone, surrounded by warriors who could tear him apart with their bare claws, and he was questioning their toughness. "Secure the prisoner," Vexstar ordered. His soldiers were taking him back to the ship. "I want to learn more about this species before we begin the invasion." As his warriors carefully lifted the injured human, Vexstar felt a surge of confidence. If this was the best humanity had to offer, the conquest would be completed within days. His tactical computers had already identified 17 human colonies within striking distance. Each one contained millions of these weak, soft-skinned beings who would make excellent slaves for the Empire. The boarding party returned to the Void Talon, leaving the damaged human ship to drift in space. Vexstar made his way back to the bridge, already planning the attack on the nearest human world. In his mind, he was composing the victory report he would send to the Krillian High Command, but as the massive warship turned toward human space, Jake Morrison sat quietly in his detention cell, carefully memorizing everything he had seen and heard. The Krillians had made their first mistake. They had judged him by his appearance rather than his capabilities. It would not be their last mistake, but it might very well be their most costly one. The detention bay aboard the Void Talon was designed to break the spirit of prisoners. The walls were made of black metal that seemed to absorb light, and the ceiling stretched high above, making anyone inside feel small and helpless. Red lights pulsed slowly along the walls, creating an atmosphere of constant unease. Jake Morrison sat on the cold metal bench in the center of the room, his broken arm now held in a crude sling made from torn fabric. The Krillian medical officer had treated his wounds just enough to keep him alive, but had done nothing for his comfort. His head still ached from the concussion, and his ribs were bruised from the crash. Despite his injuries, Jake remained alert. He had been studying the detention bay for the past 6 hours, noting every detail. The door mechanism, the ventilation system, the camera positions, the guard rotation schedule. Old habits from his Marine training died hard. The door slid open. With a soft hiss, and General Vexstar entered, followed by 2 guards. The general's massive form filled the doorway, and his yellow eyes gleamed with anticipation. He carried a small device in his clawed hand, which Jake recognized as some kind of recording equipment. "Lieutenant Morrison," Vexstar said, his voice echoing off the metal walls. "I trust you have had time to consider your situation." Jake looked up at the towering alien. "The accommodations could be better. Room service is terrible, too." Vexstar tilted his massive head, not understanding the humor. "You make jokes while your species faces extinction." "How curious." "Old habit," Jake replied. "Marines learn to find humor in bad situations. Helps with morale." "Morale?" Vexstar repeated, testing the word. "An interesting concept. Tell me, Lieutenant, what exactly is the military strength of your species?" Jake leaned back against the wall, wincing slightly from his injuries. "Why don't you tell me about yours first? Seems only fair." The question caught Vexstar off guard. In 3 centuries of conquest, no prisoner had ever asked him about Krillian military capabilities. They were usually too busy begging for mercy or cowering in terror. "Very well," the general said, activating his recording device. "Perhaps understanding our power will help you accept the futility of resistance." Vexstar gestured to the air above them, and a holographic display materialized. It showed the Krillian Empire's territory, a vast sphere of space containing hundreds of star systems. Red dots marked conquered worlds, and they stretched across multiple galactic sectors. The Krillian Empire spans 47 star systems. Vexstar began, his voice filled with pride. We command over 12,000 warships, including 200 vessels of this class. The hologram zoomed in to show ships identical to the Void Talon. Each dreadnought carries enough firepower to destroy a planet's surface in less than 1 hour. Jake studied the display with professional interest. Impressive. How long did it take you to build this empire? 300 standard years, Vexstar replied. We have never encountered a species capable of meaningful resistance. Never? Jake asked, raising an eyebrow. Never. The Zilani possessed advanced technology but were pacifists by nature. They surrendered after we destroyed a single city. The Vorthak had larger ships but lacked coordinated tactics. Their fleet scattered after their flagship was destroyed. The Selenians attempted to negotiate from the beginning. Vexstar's mandibles clicked with amusement. Most species simply surrender upon seeing our ships arrive. The hologram changed to show battle recordings from previous conquests. Jake watched as Krillian fleets overwhelmed smaller forces with overwhelming numbers and firepower. The enemy ships in the recordings seemed to fight independently, with no coordination or advanced tactics. Your opponents all seem to fight the same way, Jake observed. Individual ships, no group tactics, very predictable movements. Of course, Vexstar said, not understanding that Jake had just identified a critical weakness. How else would one fight a space battle? Jake filed that information away for later. What about ground forces? Surely some species resisted your invasions? Vexstar activated another display showing Krillian ground troops overwhelming various alien armies. Our warriors are superior? In every way, stronger, faster, better armed. Most planetary defenses collapse within days. Jake watched the recordings carefully. The Krillian soldiers were indeed impressive individually, but their tactics were crude. They relied entirely on brute force and superior numbers. There was no evidence of advanced strategy, special operations, or asymmetric warfare. Interesting, Jake said. Your soldiers fight in straight lines, no cover, no flanking maneuvers, very direct approach. Why would we need such complications? Vexstar asked. Our strength is sufficient. Has it always been sufficient? Always. The general leaned forward, bringing his massive head closer to Jake. Now, Lieutenant Morrison, I have shown you the reality of your situation. Your species faces the full might of an empire that has never known defeat. Tell me about human military capabilities so I can plan the most efficient conquest. Jake was quiet for a long moment, still studying the tactical displays. Finally, he looked directly into Vexstar's yellow eyes. General, can I ask you something first? Speak. In all these conquests, in 300 years of expansion, have you ever fought a species that actually knew how to fight? Vexstar paused. The question seemed simple enough, but something in the human's tone made him consider it carefully. What do you mean? I mean a species that had been fighting wars for thousands of years. A species that had developed real military doctrine, advanced tactics, special forces training. A species that had fought so many wars against its own kind that warfare became an art form. No, Vexstar admitted. Most species we encounter are peaceful by nature. They focus on science, philosophy, art. They build defenses but rarely use them. Jake nodded slowly. That explains a lot. Explains what? Why you think this is going to be easy? Something in Jake's voice made Vexstar uncomfortable, though he couldn't identify what. The human seemed almost pitying, as if he felt sorry for. The general, you doubt our capabilities? Vexstar asked, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. No, your capabilities are impressive, Jake said honestly. Your ships are powerful, your soldiers are strong, your numbers are overwhelming. But capabilities and experience are two different things. Meaning? Meaning you've spent 300 years fighting species that don't really know how to fight. You've developed tactics for overwhelming peaceful civilizations, not for fighting. An actual war, Vexstar's scales darkened with anger. And humans are different? Jake's expression grew serious. General, humans have been fighting each other since before we discovered fire. We've had wars that lasted decades, conflicts that reshaped entire continents. We've developed military academies, strategic doctrines, special forces, units trained for impossible missions. We fought in space, on land, in the air, underwater, and in dimensions you probably don't even know exist. Impressive boasts from a prisoner, Vextar sneered. Not boasts, Jake said quietly. Just facts. And here's another fact. Marines are the ones they send when the impossible missions need to be completed. The general studied the small, injured human for a long moment. Despite his words, Jake didn't look like a formidable warrior. He looked tired, hurt, and vastly outnumbered. We shall see, Vextar said finally. Tomorrow we reach the first human colony. You will witness the efficiency of Krillian conquest methods. As the general turned to leave, Jake called after him. General? What? You might want to record what happens tomorrow? Your superiors are going to want to see it. Vextar left the detention bay, but Jake's words echoed in his mind as he walked through the corridors of his ship. For the first time in his long military career, he felt a small knot of uncertainty in his stomach. In his cell, Jake Morrison closed his eyes and began to rest. Tomorrow would bring the real test, and he wanted to be ready for it. The Krillian invasion fleet dropped out of hyperspace like a swarm of metal predators. 200 warships materialized in the void around New Haven, their dark hulls blocking out the stars. The massive vessels arranged themselves in perfect formation, their weapon systems already charging with deadly energy on the bridge of the Void Talon. General Vextar watched the tactical display with satisfaction. The human colony world hung before them like a blue and green jewel, completely unaware of the doom that had just arrived. His sensors showed a population of 2.3 million beings scattered across 3 continents, with most living in peaceful cities far from any military installations. Report, Vextar commanded. Commander Zekthil consulted his instruments. Orbital defenses are minimal, General. 12 defense platforms mounting kinetic cannons and basic energy shields. The colonial fleet consists of 37 vessels, mostly cargo ships and civilian transports. Only 8 appear to be actual military craft. Vextar's mandibles clicked with amusement. 8 military ships against 200 Krillian dreadnoughts. The humans would be vaporized in minutes once the attack began. What about planetary defenses? Surface scans show scattered military installations, but nothing significant. Basic missile batteries, some ground-based energy weapons, standard defensive barriers around major population centers. Their technology appears to be at least 50 years behind our own. Excellent. Any response from the planet? Yes, General. They are attempting to establish communication. Put them through. I want them to see what they face before they die. The main view screen flickered to life, showing the interior of what appeared to be a human military command center. The room was smaller and more cramped than Krillian facilities, with banks of primitive computers and display screens showing tactical information. Several humans in military uniforms moved urgently between workstations. At the center of the room stood a human female wearing the insignia of a commander. She appeared to be in her 40s, with short blonde hair and steady blue eyes. Despite facing an overwhelming enemy force, she showed no signs of panic or fear. I am Commander Lisa Brooks of the New Haven Colonial Defense Force, she said, her voice calm and professional. You are in violation of human territorial space. State your intentions. Vextar stepped into view of the communication pickup, his massive form filling the screen. He saw several humans in the background step back, involuntarily at the sight of him, but Commander Brooks remained steady. I am General Vextar of the Krillian Empire, he announced. I am here to accept your unconditional surrender and begin the process of adding your world to our territory. Brooks studied the general for a moment. I don't think that's going to happen, General, the response surprised Vextar. Every other species had immediately begun negotiating or begging for mercy at this point. The humans seemed almost defiant. Commander Brooks, perhaps you do not understand your situation. I command 200 warships. Your entire defensive fleet could not defeat a single one of my vessels. Surrender now, and your people will be allowed to live as subjects of the Empire. And if we refuse? Then I will demonstrate why 47 worlds have chosen to submit rather than resist. Brooks nodded slowly. I see. General, before you begin your attack, I should probably mention something. Speak. You have one of our Marines aboard your ship. Vextar felt a flicker of confusion. The prisoner? Lieutenant Morrison? What relevance does this have? I'd suggest returning him immediately. The general's laugh echoed across the bridge. Commander, your lone Marine is injured and imprisoned aboard my flagship. He poses no threat to anyone. That's where you're wrong, General. Brooks' expression grew serious. Jake Morrison isn't just any Marine. He's reconnaissance force. Do you know what that means? Enlighten me. It means he's been studying you. Your ships, your weapons, your tactics, your weaknesses. And it means he's been transmitting that information to us since the moment you captured him. Vextar's yellow eyes widened. Impossible. We destroyed his ship's communication systems. You destroyed his ship's communication systems, Brooks agreed. But Marines carry backup equipment. Short-range quantum transmitters built into their gear. We've been receiving his reports for the past 3 days. The general turned to his communication officer. Is this possible? Scanning now, General, the officer replied nervously. After a moment, his scales paled. Sir, I'm detecting a faint quantum signal emanating from the detention bay. It's been broadcasting continuously since we brought the prisoner aboard. Vextar felt the first real stab of uncertainty he had experienced in decades. The humans had been gathering intelligence on his fleet while he thought he was interrogating their representative. No matter, he said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Knowledge of our capabilities will not save you from them. We'll see about that, Brooks replied. General, you have 1 hour to return Lieutenant Morrison and withdraw from our system. After that, we'll consider your presence an act of war. An hour? Vextar's anger flared. Commander, I could destroy your entire planet in less than an hour. What could you possibly do to threaten my fleet? You'll find out if you don't leave. Brooks paused, then added, Oh, and General? You might want to check your long-range sensors. I think you'll find the tactical situation has changed. The communication cut off, leaving the bridge in tense silence. Vextar turned to his sensor operator. Long-range scan. Full spectrum. The operator's claws moved over his controls, then froze. General ... I'm detecting additional ships approaching our position. How many? I'm not sure, sir. The signatures are strange. Some appear to be human vessels, but others... The operator looked up with confusion in his eyes. Sir, some of these ships are using Zalani technology. Others appear to be Vorthic designs. I'm even seeing what looks like Selenian craft. Vextar stared at the tactical display as new contacts appeared on the screen. Ships from 6. Different species, all approaching New Haven from different directions. Species that were supposed to be conquered slaves of the Krillian Empire. How is this possible? He whispered in the detention bay. Jake Morrison sat quietly on his bench, a small smile playing across his lips. The quantum transmitter hidden in his boot had been broadcasting continuously since his capture, sending detailed intelligence about Krillian ship designs, weapon capabilities, tactical doctrines, and most importantly, their weaknesses, but more than that, it had been sending a simple message to every resistance cell, every hidden rebel group, every enslaved species in this sector of the galaxy. The time had come to fight back. The Krillians had made a fundamental error. They had assumed that their conquered territories would remain conquered forever. They had never considered that someone might teach their slaves how to fight. Jake had been doing more than gathering intelligence during his imprisonment. He had been serving as the central coordination point for the largest military uprising in galactic history. The general who had laughed at a single injured Marine was about to learn what happened when that Marine was connected to a network of resistance fighters spanning dozens of worlds on the bridge of the Void Talon. Alarms began to sound as more ships appeared on the sensors. Vextar watched his tactical display with growing horror as he realized that he wasn't facing a single weak colony anymore. He was facing a coalition, and at the center of it all was the small, Injured human he had dismissed as harmless. Jake Morrison closed his eyes and waited for the battle to begin. The Krillians were about to get their first real lesson in human military doctrine. The lesson would be painful. The hour deadline passed in tense silence. General Vextar stood on his bridge, watching the tactical display as more ships continued to appear around. New Haven, what had started as a simple colonial conquest, was turning into something he had never encountered before. Final count, Commander Zechthel. Vextar ordered. His second-in-command consulted the sensors with obvious unease. 347 vessels now in the system, General. Mixed fleet composition from at least 12 different species. They're maintaining position just outside our weapons range. Vextar studied the formation. The enemy ships were arranged in a complex pattern that seemed random at first glance. But the more he looked at it, the more he realized there was a sophisticated strategy behind their positioning. Small, fast ships were positioned to dart between his larger vessels. Medium cruisers formed overlapping fields of fire. The larger ships hung back, ready to provide heavy support. It was unlike anything he had seen in 3 centuries of conquest. "Open a channel to the detention bay," he commanded. "I want to speak with the prisoner." Minutes later, Jake Morrison appeared on the screen. Despite his injuries, he looked alert and ready. Behind him, 2 Krillian guards stood at attention, their weapons trained on him. "General," Jake said calmly, "I see your hour is up." "Lieutenant Morrison," Vextar began, his voice strained, "what you have done is impossible. The species surrounding this planet are conquered territories of the Krillian Empire. They cannot rebel. We destroyed their military capabilities decades ago." Jake shifted slightly on his bench, wincing from his broken ribs. "General, can I ask you something? Speak. In all your conquests, what did you do with the survivors after the fighting ended?" Vextar was puzzled by the question. The survivors were relocated to labor colonies or kept as servants. Why does this matter? And their children? What happened to them? They were raised to serve the Empire. What is your point, Lieutenant? Jake smiled, and there was something dangerous in that expression. My point is that you left them alive. And alive people can be taught new things. The implications hit Vextar like a physical blow. You trained them. We trained them, Jake confirmed. For the past 5 years, human military advisors have been secretly working with resistance groups across your empire, teaching them tactics, providing them with weapons, showing them how to coordinate operations. Impossible we would have detected such activities. Would you? General, you just spent 3 days interrogating me without realizing I was transmitting intelligence reports. You assumed your security was perfect because no one had ever challenged it before. Vextar felt his confidence crumbling. Even if this is true, they are still using inferior technology. Their ships are decades behind ours. Technology isn't everything, Jake replied. You taught me that yourself when you showed me your conquest records. All those species you defeated had advanced technology too, but they didn't know how to use it effectively. On the main view screen, the enemy fleet began to move. But instead of charging directly at the Krillian formation like every other species had done, they moved in coordinated groups, small squadrons. Of fast ships darted forward, fired quick salvos, and retreated before the Krillians could respond. Other groups moved to flank the invasion fleet from multiple directions. What are they doing? Vextar demanded of his tactical officer. Unknown. Sir? Their movements don't match any combat doctrine in our databases. Jake's voice came from the detention bay screen. They're using human tactics, General. Hit and run attacks, coordinated strikes, flanking maneuvers. Things we learned fighting each other over thousands of years. The first exchange of weapons fire lit up the void around New Haven. Krillian plasma beams lanced out at the enemy ships, but most of them had already moved by the time the energy reached their previous positions. In response, the coalition forces unleashed a storm of missiles, kinetic projectiles, and energy weapons from multiple directions. Vextar watched in growing alarm as his fleet's perfect formation began to break apart. His ships were designed to fight in straight lines, overwhelming enemies with superior firepower, But the enemy wasn't staying still long enough to be overwhelmed. "Damage report," he barked. 17 ships reporting hits, General. The Crimson Fang has lost main engines. The Death's Head is venting atmosphere from multiple hull breaches. 17 ships damaged in the first exchange. In 300 years of conquest, Vexstar had never lost 17 ships in an entire campaign, let alone in the opening minutes of a battle. How is this possible? He whispered. Jake heard the question through the communication link. "General, you asked me what a Marine does. I told you we fight. But I didn't explain what that really means." Vexstar turned his attention back to the screen showing the detention bay. "Explain it now." "Marines are the ones they send when regular troops can't get the job done. We specialize in impossible missions, desperate situations, overwhelming odds. We're trained to think, adapt, and overcome any challenge." Another wave of attacks struck the Krillian fleet. This time, the enemy ships focused their fire on specific targets, concentrating their entire force on individual Krillian vessels. The Bone Crusher, a heavy cruiser, simply disappeared in a ball of fire as hundreds of missiles and energy beams struck it simultaneously. "But more than that," Jake continued, "Marines are teachers. When we find people who want to fight for their freedom, we show them how. We don't just give them weapons. We give them knowledge, tactics, hope." Vexthal watched his tactical display with growing horror. His fleet was being systematically taken apart by an enemy that refused to fight the way they were supposed to. Ships that should have been easy prey were working together like parts of a single organism. "Every person in that fleet out there learned from human instructors," Jake said. "Zilani engineers learned how to modify their shields for maximum efficiency. Vorthok pilots learned evasive maneuvers and formation flying. Selenian tacticians learned how to coordinate multi-species operations." The general's yellow eyes fixed on Jake with new understanding. "You didn't just gather intelligence. You planned this entire operation." "I helped plan it," Jake corrected. "This operation has been months in the making. Every resistance cell, every hidden weapons cache, every training facility across your empire has been building toward this moment." "But why here? Why this colony?" Jake's expression grew serious. "Because New Haven isn't just any colony, General. It's a training ground. Half the people down there are military instructors, special operations personnel, and tactical coordinators. You didn't attack a defenseless farming world. You attacked the central command post for the largest military uprising in galactic history." Vexstar stared at the screen in shock. Everything he thought he knew about this operation had been wrong from the beginning. The damaged scout ship, the injured Marine, the helpless colony, it had all been a trap. "You used yourself as bait?" He realized, "Sometimes that's what Marines do," Jake replied. "We put ourselves in danger to accomplish the mission." "And General? The mission here wasn't just to gather intelligence or coordinate an attack. Then what was it?" Jake's smile was cold and hard. "The mission was to teach you what happens when you underestimate humanity." On the tactical display, another Krillian ship exploded. Then another. The perfect formation that had intimidated dozens of species was crumbling under the coordinated assault of enemies who had learned to fight like humans. For the first time in his long military career, General Vexstar was losing a battle, and the small, injured human he had dismissed as harmless was the one teaching him the lesson. The education was just beginning. The battle that should have lasted minutes stretched into its third hour. General Vexstar watched his tactical display with growing disbelief as his supposedly invincible fleet continued to take losses. 23 Krillian ships had been destroyed, and twice that number were damaged and limping back from the combat zone. The enemy coalition moved like a living thing, constantly shifting and adapting. When his ships concentrated fire on one group, another would appear from a different angle. When he tried to pursue the smaller vessels, the larger ships would emerge from behind asteroid cover to hammer his forces with heavy weapons. "Sir, Commander," Zekthal reported, his voice strained. "The Vorthak ships are using ramming attacks. They're sacrificing their vessels to take out our heavy cruisers." Vexstar stared at the screen as a modified Vorthak freighter, its hull glowing with the heat of overloaded engines, slammed into the side of the Krillian battleship Iron Fist. The explosion was visible even from thousands of kilometers away, and when the light faded, both ships were gone. "Madness," he whispered. "They're destroying their own ships." Jake Morrison's voice came from the detention bay communicator, which Vexstar had left open to monitor the prisoner. "Not madness, General. Sacrifice. There's a difference." "How can you call such waste tactical?" "Because sometimes one ship dying means 10 others survive. It's called acceptable losses, and it's a concept your people never had to learn." On the display, Vexstar watched a group of small Zilani vessels dart between his dreadnoughts, their modified shields deflecting plasma fire while they planted what looked like mining charges on his ship's hulls. The charges exploded in sequence, tearing massive holes in the armor of 3 different Krillian vessels. "Where did they get those weapons?" Vexstar demanded. "Human mining equipment, Jake," replied calmly. "Modified for military use. The Zilani were always good with technology. They just needed someone to show them how to weaponize it." Another alarm sounded on the bridge. The sensor operator looked up with panic in his yellow eyes. "General, I'm detecting new contacts. Multiple ships dropping out of hyperspace. More coalition forces?" "No, sir. These are our ships." "Krillian vessels from the Outer Rim territories?" Vexstar felt a surge of relief. "Reinforcements at last. How many?" 47 ships, sir." "But General—" The operator paused, his claws trembling over his controls. "They're not responding to our communication attempts." "And their formations are wrong?" The relief turned to ice in Vexstar's stomach. "Show me." The main screen shifted to display the new arrivals. They were indeed Krillian ships, but something was wrong with them. Their hulls bore scorch marks and improvised repairs. More importantly, they were flying alongside ships from a dozen different species, all moving in the same coordinated patterns as the coalition forces around New Haven. "Impossible," Vexstar breathed. Jake's laugh came from the communicator. "General, did you really think the uprising was limited to this one system? The Outer Rim territories are secure. We have garrison fleets in every sector." "You had garrison fleets?" Jake corrected. "Past tense. Those ships out there? They used to belong to your empire. Now they belong to their crews." "The implications?" Hit Vexstar like a physical blow. "Mutiny." "Liberation," Jake replied. "Turns out a lot of your subject species didn't enjoy being slaves. When human advisors showed up with weapons, training, and a plan for freedom, they were more than willing to listen." Commander Zechthel stared at his displays in horror. "Sir, the new arrivals are taking position with the coalition forces. We're now outnumbered 4-1. But numbers weren't the worst part. The worst part was watching ships that had served the Krillian Empire for decades now turning their weapons against their former masters. Vessels that Vexstar recognized, commanded by species he had conquered personally, were now part of the force arrayed against him. "How long?" he asked quietly. "How long what, General?" Jake's voice held no mockery now, only professional respect for a defeated enemy. "How long have you been planning this?" "The initial planning started about 6 years ago," Jake replied. "But humans have been making contact with resistance groups across your empire for much longer than that." "We've been watching the Krillian Empire for decades, waiting for the right moment." "Waiting for what?" "For you to attack a human colony. You see, General, we needed you to make the first move. We needed the galaxy to see that the Krillian Empire was still expanding, still conquering. That gave us the moral authority to coordinate a defensive response." Vexstar closed his eyes. Every decision he had made, from capturing the human scout ship to attacking New Haven, had been anticipated and planned for. The humans had manipulated him into this exact situation. "The scout ship," he said suddenly. "It wasn't damaged in a battle, was it?" "No," Jake admitted. "We disabled it ourselves and put it exactly where you would find it. We needed to get someone aboard your flagship to coordinate the final phase of the operation. You volunteered to be captured. I volunteered for the mission. Being captured was part of the plan." Another series of explosions lit up space as more Krillian ships fell to the coordinated assault. The Iron Will, one of Vextar's oldest and most reliable captains, sent a final transmission before his ship broke apart under concentrated fire from a mixed squadron of human, Selenian, and Vorthek vessels. Status report, Vextar ordered weakly. 51 ships destroyed, General. 38 more reporting critical damage. The fleet is scattered across 3 light minutes of space, and most formations have broken apart completely. And the enemy? Approximately 20 vessels lost, sir, all smaller craft. None of their major ships have been seriously damaged. Vextar slumped in his command chair. In 3 hours of combat, he had lost over a third of his invasion fleet while barely scratching the enemy force. It was the worst military disaster in Krillian history. General, Jake's voice came from the communicator, gentler now. Your fleet is beaten. Your empire is in full revolt. You can keep fighting and watch the rest of your ships die, or you can accept that the war is over. What are your terms? Vextar asked, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. Full withdrawal from all conquered territories. Reparations for enslaved populations. Submission to a new galactic council with representatives from all species. Your personal surrender for war crimes trials. The terms were harsh but not unexpected. Vextar had imposed similar conditions on dozens of species over the centuries. The irony was not lost on him. And if I refuse? Then this battle continues until every Krillian ship in this system is destroyed. Then the coalition moves on to the next Krillian system and the next until your entire empire is liberated one world at a time. Vextar looked around his bridge at the faces of his surviving crew. They were looking to him for orders, but what orders could he give? Continue a battle they had already lost? Sacrifice more ships for the sake of pride? For the first time in his long military career, General Vextar was faced with a choice between pride and survival. The human had taught him what real warfare looked like. Now he had to decide if he was smart enough to learn the lesson. General Vextar sat in his command chair for long minutes, staring at the tactical display that showed the wreckage of his once mighty fleet. The bridge was silent except for the soft beeping of emergency systems and the distant rumble of damaged engines. His crew waited for orders that he was no longer sure how to give. Finally, he activated the communicator to the detention bay. Lieutenant Morrison, yes, General? How? The single word carried the weight of 3 centuries of Krillian military dominance. How did we not see this coming? Jake's voice came through clearly, without any trace of triumph or mockery. Because you judged us by our appearance instead of our capabilities, General. You saw one injured Marine and assumed all humans were weak. You conquered peaceful species and thought you understood warfare. We are superior warriors, Vextar said, though his voice lacked conviction. Stronger, faster, better armed. You're superior individual fighters? Jake agreed. In single combat, a Krillian warrior could probably defeat any human. But warfare isn't about individual strength anymore, General. It's about coordination, strategy, adaptation, and understanding your enemy. Vextar looked around his bridge, at his surviving officers. They were indeed impressive physical specimens, each one capable of tearing apart most other species with their bare claws. But they had been trained to follow orders, not to think independently or adapt to changing situations. Explain, he said simply. Every human child learns about the Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans held off thousands of Persian warriors. We learn about the Alamo, where a small garrison fought to the last man against overwhelming odds. We study Iwo Jima, where Marines took an island that should have been impossible to capture. The human's voice carried a quiet pride that Vextar was beginning to understand. But more importantly, Jake continued, we learn from our failures too. We study every defeat, every tactical mistake, every strategic error. Then we adapt and improve. Humans have been fighting wars for thousands of years, General. Against ourselves, against nature, against impossible odds. It's made us very good at it. And the other species? How did you turn our conquered territories against us? We didn't turn them against you, they were already against you. They just didn't know how to fight back effectively. We taught them. Commander. Zechthel approached Vextar's chair hesitantly. General, we're receiving surrender requests from 17 more ships. Their commanders are asking for permission to stand down. Vextar closed his eyes. His fleet was collapsing not just from enemy fire, but from broken morale. His captains had never faced real opposition before, and they didn't know how to handle sustained combat against a competent enemy. Jake Morrison, he said into the communicator. Yes, General? What happens to my people if I surrender? Will they be executed? Enslaved like we enslaved others? There was a pause before Jake answered. That depends on what they do next. War. Criminals will face trial, but regular soldiers and civilians? They'll be allowed to return home and rebuild. That's the difference between conquest and liberation, General. We're not here to destroy the Krillian people. We're here to end the Krillian Empire. And me? You'll face a military tribunal for war crimes. But given your cooperation today, and the fact that you're willing to end this without further bloodshed, the tribunal will probably be lenient. Exile instead of execution. Vextar considered this. Exile was better than death, and far better than watching the rest of his fleet die for no purpose. But more than that, he was beginning to understand something that had eluded him throughout his military career. Lieutenant Morrison, may I ask you a personal question? Go ahead. Why did you volunteer for this mission? You knew it would likely result in your capture, injury, possibly death. What could be worth such a risk? Jake was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that Vextar recognized from his own younger days, when he had believed in something greater than himself. Because freedom isn't something you can take away permanently, General. You can suppress it, delay it, make people forget about it temporarily, but it always comes back. And when it does, it's stronger than before. The Zelani were free before. We conquered them, the Vorthak, the Selenians, all of them. They were living their own lives, making their own choices, determining their own futures. You took that away from them. They were weak, Vextar protested, but the words sounded hollow even to him. They were peaceful, Jake corrected. There's a difference. Being peaceful doesn't make you weak, it makes you civilized. But when civilization is threatened, peaceful people can learn to fight just as hard as anyone else. On the tactical display, the coalition fleet had formed a perfect encirclement around the remaining Krillian ships. They weren't attacking anymore, just waiting. The message was clear: surrender or be destroyed. General, Commander Zechthel said quietly, what are your orders? Vextar looked at the display one more time. 87 ships left out of 200. His crews were demoralized, his formations broken, his empire in revolt. He could order a final charge, a glorious last stand that would accomplish nothing except adding more names to the casualty lists, or he could accept that he had been outfought by a better enemy. Open a general fleet channel, he ordered. Yes, sir. All Krillian vessels, this is General Vextar. Stand down all weapons and prepare to surrender. The battle is over. The words felt strange in his mouth, but also strangely liberating. For the first time in decades, he wasn't responsible for planning the next conquest or the next battle. The war was over, and despite everything, he was still alive. Lieutenant Morrison, he said into the communicator. Yes, General? I have one final question. What's that? When the tribunal asks me why I surrendered, what should I tell them? Jake's answer came without hesitation. Tell them you learned the difference between strength and power. Strength is what you use to protect people. Power is what you use to control them. The Krillian Empire had power. The Coalition has strength. And humans? Humans understand that real strength comes from working together, from teaching others, from making allies instead of slaves. We don't fight to conquer, General. We fight to protect. That's why we always win in the end. Vextar stood up from his command chair and walked to the view screen. Outside, the stars shone peacefully, no longer obscured by the flashes of weapons fire. In the distance, he could see the blue and green world of New Haven, still intact, still free. Computer, record a message for transmission to Krillian High Command, he said formally. Recording. This is General Vexstar of the Third Fleet. The invasion of human space has failed. The Krillian Empire is in full revolt. I am surrendering my remaining forces to prevent further bloodshed. The age of conquest is over. We must learn to live as one species among many, not as masters of the galaxy. He paused, thinking of the small human who had taught him more about warfare in 3 days than he had learned in 3 centuries. Personal note to any Krillian commander who receives this message: never underestimate humans. They are not what they appear to be. They are something far more dangerous and far more admirable. They are teachers, and they have taught the galaxy how to be free, the recording ended. Around him, his bridge crew began the process of formal surrender. Outside, the Coalition fleet waited patiently for the Krillian survivors to stand down. In the detention bay, Jake Morrison finally allowed himself to relax. The mission was complete. The galaxy was free. And somewhere in human space, other Marines were already preparing for the next impossible mission. The next fight for freedom. It was, he thought, a good day to be human.